Okay, let's unpack this. American foreign policy. It can feel like a pendulum swinging wildly, right?
Totally. Yeah.
From, global cooperation and engagement to something more insular, America first. Especially if you think about the Trump administration.
Hmm.
It really makes you wonder if these shifts are just like the result of whoever's in the White House at the time.
That's a really insightful starting point. And, well, while individual leaders definitely have an impact, what's fascinating here is this idea of a more fundamental, uh, bottom-level logic.
A deeper logic.
Yeah, something that's been shaping these tendencies for a long, long time, much
Yeah.
deeper than any single presidency.
Exactly. And to really understand that, we're not just looking at the latest headlines or tweets.
No, definitely not.
We need to go way back, like way back to the very beginnings of American history and culture.
Right.
And that brings us to a really crucial figure, John Winthrop.
Ah, Winthrop.
Yeah. For those maybe not familiar, Winthrop was a key leader in the early North American Massachusetts Bay Company. Became its governor, actually.
Precisely. And our mission in this deep dive really is to uncover how the beliefs and experiences of these early Puritan settlers,
The ones Winthrop led.
exactly, how they established some core principles that, well, arguably still influence American actions today, often in subtle but pretty powerful ways.
Okay, so let's dive into Winthrop himself then. Who owned this guy, and why does his story hold a key to understanding, modern American policy?
Well, John Winthrop, he was a well-educated English nobleman back in the 16th and 17th centuries, and a deeply committed Puritan.
Okay, Puritan. What did that mean back then in that context?
So Puritanism was a major religious movement in England. It stressed, individual piety, a direct relationship with God, and the importance of a strong moral community.
Right.
But this period was also marked by huge religious conflict across England, across Europe, and under King Charles I, Puritan beliefs, they often weren't tolerated.
So people like Winthrop faced problems.
Big problems. Political marginalization, definitely.
So he was in a tough spot because of his religion. How did the Massachusetts Bay Company become his way out?
Well, amidst all this religious tension, Winthrop managed to acquire a pretty substantial stake in the Massachusetts Bay Company.
Which was initially just a business thing.
Pretty much. Initially, the plan was to run it from England. But as things got worse for Puritans, Winthrop and his associates took a really bold step.
Okay.
They found some, let's say, ambiguities in the company's charter, things that allowed them to propose moving the entire operation,
The whole company.
the whole thing,
Yeah.
across the Atlantic to North America.
Wow, that is a huge decision. Like moving an entire company, that feels like more than just business.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
Winthrop, being this deeply religious leader, he framed it differently. He imbued this whole migration with profound religious meaning.
How so?
He basically presented it to his followers as a divinely ordained exodus, a chance to leave behind what they saw as the corruption of England and establish a new, pure Puritan society over in Massachusetts Bay.
And this is where we get that really powerful image, isn't it? The city upon a hill.
Yeah.
That idea of America as a shining example.
Exactly. That's Winthrop. He famously invoked this concept from the Gospel of Matthew. He envisioned their new settlement as this uniquely virtuous, exemplary nation,
A model for everyone else.
a city upon a hill for all the world to observe. And this idea, of American exceptionalism, of moral leadership, born right there in that early vision, it's had a remarkably long-lasting impact.
You can really see that thread through history.
Absolutely. You see echoes of it later in Justifications for Intervention, this idea that America has some special responsibility to be a beacon of righteousness.
Okay, so they arrive in North America. They've got this strong religious mission. But how does a commercial company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, actually turn into a government?
Well, under Winthrop's guidance, this was in the 1630s, the company went through a major transformation. It essentially transitioned from being just a commercial venture into a proper civic government.
Mm.
And the crucial part is, this new political entity was explicitly religious,
So rooted in those Puritan ideals we talked about.
deeply rooted. And their determination to cut ties with Europe, especially England, who they saw as their persecutors, was, well, absolute.
So it wasn't just about finding religious freedom for themselves. It was about creating something totally separate, free from the old world's problems.
Precisely. It's like the political scientist Eric Vogelin described them. He called these Puritan immigrants religious revolutionaries.
Revolutionaries.
Their goal wasn't just to, tweak things in Europe from afar. It was a permanent separation, to create a space where they could freely practice their beliefs without all the constraints of European society and history.
Freedom of thought, freedom of belief, but on their terms.
Exactly. In this new land.
And it wasn't exactly a democracy like we think of it today, was it, who got to participate?
That's a really key point to understand. In these early colonies, political participation was largely restricted,
To who?
mostly to Puritan men who were also church members. If you didn't adhere to their specific religious beliefs, well, you generally didn't get a say in how things were run.
So very much a theocracy in practice.
Definitely underscores the theocratic nature.
Right.
Religious law heavily influenced civil law. And this model, this sort of Puritan-dominated colony, actually became pretty common across early North America.
Okay, so if we boil it down, what are the essential ingredients of this early American identity, the one that grew out of this intense Puritan experience?
At its core, I'd say it's a potent mix. First, a really fervent form of Puritanism, like an intense, unwavering faith,
All right, not mild.
not mild at all. And second, coupled with that, a powerful sense of separatism, a rejection of Europe, the old world system, the whole thing.
It's interesting you mentioned how this might contrast with how American identity is taught elsewhere.
Yeah, for example, in Chinese history education, the source material, notes, the emphasis is often put on later documents, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, seeing those as the real starting points of American identity.
But you're arguing that those later crucial documents are actually built on something deeper, this earlier foundation.
Exactly. While the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are obviously massively significant, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. They emerged from this earlier cultural and historical bedrock laid by those early Puritan settlers and that initial desire for separation.
Okay, I see the connection. Now, how does this historical understanding, how does it connect to more contemporary stuff, like that foreign policy article you mentioned from earlier this year?
Right, the one asking Europe has become America's enemy.
Yes,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
one.
Yeah.
It highlighted Vice President Pence's pretty direct, almost confrontational speech at the Munich Security Conference.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is how surprised the article seemed by this shift in tone, this sort of more confrontational stance towards traditional allies like Europe. But if you look at it through this lens we've been discussing, this underlying logic, this historical tension, almost inherent antagonism between a U.S. rooted in separatism and the old world of Europe.
It doesn't seem so surprising anymore.
Not nearly as surprising. In fact, you could almost argue that a complete lack of friction with Europe would be the more historically strange thing for the U.S.
Huh. That really does flip how you might read current events. What looks like a new development might actually be like a return to form, a resurgence of something older.
Precisely. And this worldview wasn't just about Europe. The early Puritans often viewed, say, East Asia as barbaric, uncivilized.
Part of the same pattern.
Yeah, and another aspect of their foundational perspective on the world outside their city upon a hill. Now, obviously, individual American beliefs have evolved massively over centuries.
Of course.
But that underlying national spirit, the operational logic, it seems to retain a certain continuity,
Yeah.
rooted in this early Puritanism and its rejection of the old world.
So this intense Puritan drive, this desire to be separate, morally pure, how does that then play out in those seemingly contradictory swings between isolationism and then, interventionism?
Ah, that's the crucial connection, this underlying puritanical fervor. It can express itself in two ways that look like opposites.
Okay.
On one hand, it fuels isolationism, that impulse to separate from a corrupt, entangling old world, keep pure.
Pull back.
But on the other hand, it can also ignite this almost crusader-like passion, a zeal to reform the world or even reshape it according to its own ideals.
So not really contradictions.
More like two sides of the same coin, different expressions of the same core American dream, if you want to call it that.
Okay, let's explore the isolationist side first. What are some big historical examples of that in action?
Well, the prime example has to be George Washington's 1796 farewell address.
Ah, yes. Famous warning.
Absolutely. He strongly warned against forming permanent alliances with foreign powers. He saw foreign influence as a major threat to American republicanism.
What did he advise instead?
Basically, prioritize commerce trade is fine, but minimize political connections, especially with Europe, whose interests he saw as largely separate and potentially conflicting with America's.
So Washington was essentially channeling that early Puritan desire, wasn't he? Stay apart from the old world's messes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His feelings line up very closely with those separatist ideals of Winthrop and the early settlers. He was saying, effectively, Look, we can trade with the world, but let's keep our political distance from the dangers and entanglements over there, especially in Europe.
But then history shows the U.S. did get involved, increasingly so. What drove that shift away from isolationism?
Well, the U.S. gradually moved away from strict isolationism, really starting after the mid-19th century. Several factors were involved.
Like what?
Big ones were industrialization, the sheer growth of American economic power, and the development of its naval power, sea power became crucial.
And specific events pushed this along.
Definitely.
Hmm.
Things like the Spanish-American War, and then, of course, U.S. involvement in World War I and World War II. These are clear markers of increasing intervention in global affairs.
So that initial impulse to separate seemed to give way to an impulse to actively engage, sometimes pretty forcefully. But the underlying motivation, you're saying, was still rooted in that passionate, almost moral conviction.
Precisely. Whether it's the Puritan desire for separation or the crusading impulse to remake the world, both seem fueled by a deep-seated conviction, a kind of zeal.
Right.
Now, obviously, this crusader spirit isn't purely religious anymore. Economic interest, strategic power, they're all mixed in.
Sure, practical realities.
But that underlying fervor, that sense of a unique mission, perhaps, that remains a powerful undercurrent.
And how did this Puritan crusade, as you called it, look in the 20th century? What were the main methods?
Okay, so in the 20th century, the U.S. used several key methods to exert global influence, arguably driven by this underlying crusader mentality. First, there was a promotion of what you could call the Atlantic Revolution narrative. Meaning positioning the American Revolution as the model for modern Republican revolutions, often contrasting it favorably with, say, the French Revolution, which is often the focus in Europe.
So, selling the American model as superior.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Framing American political institutions as the best, especially for the developing world or non-democratic nations, it was about establishing the U.S. as the global leader in republicanism, subtly pushing back against European influence.
Okay, that's one. What was the second method?
The second was the really vigorous promotion of free markets and free trade.
Economics as influence.
Exactly. American policymakers, thinkers, businesses. They argued that their specific mix of political systems and economic rules was essential for global prosperity and freedom, basically advocating for the whole world to adopt American-style economic and political principles.
Makes sense. And the third pillar?
Military power. Can't forget that. After World War II, the U.S. established a massive global military presence.
The world police idea.
Kind of, yeah. Acting in that role sometimes. And this was backed by huge military spending. Though, interestingly, the percentage of GDP spent on the military actually decreased over time.
Why was that?
Partly because the U.S. benefited so much from the global free trade network it helped create and dominate. But yeah, this whole 20th century crusade involved politicians, academics, businesses, the military, all pushing this interconnected system of global influence.
And it's this more recent focus, this globalism and interventionism, that might have made people forget about those original Puritan roots.
I think so, precisely. Many people today probably understand the American dream, mainly in terms of like economic opportunity and liberal democracy.
Which are important, of course.
Absolutely. But they might overlook its deeper origins in this really fervent Puritanism, a Puritanism that can show up either as wanting to withdraw or wanting to reshape the world. The American dream, historically, seems rooted in that core drive, just expressed differently over time.
So this constant back and forth we see, pulling back, engaging deeply. It's not just random policy shifts, it's almost baked into the American identity. This tension between the separatist creed and the crusading zeal.
Exactly. That's the argument. U.S. policies, political, economic, military, diplomatic aftermath, they tend to swing between these two poles.
And what decides which way it swings?
Ultimately, the decision seems to be based on what's perceived at that moment to be in the best interest of the United States. It's pragmatic in a way, but driven by these deeper currents.
It sounds, well, potentially exhausting. As a national psyche, does this constant shifting bother Americans, do you think?
You know, interestingly, the source material suggests the prevailing sentiment is, no, not really.
Really?
In fact, it's often embraced, seen almost as dynamism or resolve. And this seems to stem from something fundamental in the American character, maybe going all the way back to those origins as intensely driven, religiously motivated settlers.
Like it's just part of the cultural DNA.
Deeply ingrained. That underlying logic. You mentioned a quote earlier.
Yes, from Paul Johnson.
That's the one. In A History of the American People, he describes Americans as often, self-opinionated, fanatical, uncompromising, arrogant, but also energetic, resilient, courageous.
A double-edged sword.
Exactly. He points out this intense passion can be incredibly constructive, but also potentially very dangerous. And while maybe the last few decades have emphasized the constructive side,
We might see the other side more in the future.
it's certainly possible that future decades could reveal its more destructive potential. But this fundamental underlying logic of American identity, the argument is that is unlikely to change radically.
Okay, so where does someone like Donald Trump fit into all this? He certainly seemed to embody some of those, well, energetic and maybe uncompromising traits you mentioned.
Right. Donald Trump, in many ways, can be seen as a kind of quintessential American figure, precisely because of his often bold, maybe crazy ideas, combined with a perceived strong ability to execute them.
So regardless of what you think of his politics,
Exactly. Regardless of individual views, his character, his approach, they seem to resonate with key aspects of this American identity, rooted in the underlying logic we've been talking about.
it's a perspective that might be hard for people outside that American cultural context to really grasp, though.
That's a really crucial observation the source makes. There seems to be a genuine difficulty in some communities, the Chinese communities specifically mention, to truly understand America in figures like Trump.
Why is that thought to be the case?
It's attributed partly to a perceived fundamental difference in national character, the American sort of fervor and dynamism versus perhaps a different cultural emphasis, maybe perceived as more passive, rooted in Confucianism in the Chinese example.
And that lack of understanding could have real consequences.
Absolutely. It can lead to miscalculations, flawed policy decisions when dealing with the U.S., and those could have pretty significant long-term consequences.
Okay, so to try and wrap this all up, this seemingly contradictory behavior in American foreign policy, the swings between engaging the world and pulling back, it's not just random. It's not just about the leader of the day.
No. The argument is it's deeply rooted in this history, this initial Puritan drive to create something separate, something exceptional,
A drive that can push America to withdraw.
or push it to project its power and influence outward with immense conviction, two sides of the same passionate coin.
So to really get it, you have to look beyond the surface politics.
Precisely. You need to recognize the enduring influence of those early Puritan roots and this inherent tension between isolationism and interventionism that keeps shaping American actions.
It definitely gives you a deeper lens to view things through. So as we finish this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah.
How might this bottom-level logic continue to shape American policy, both domestic and foreign, in the years ahead? What unexpected forms might it take as the U.S. faces, well, an increasingly complex world?
That is definitely food for thought.